Thank you very much, Jacques, Christian, Gregor, Nicolas, for inviting me to what looks to be a very inspiring conference. I think the idea of looking at institutional change and experimentation at this particular point is a really important one, because as we look around the Americas, around Europe, around Asia, what we see increasingly is firms, localities, governments looking for ways out of what I'm going to refer to as blockages and traps into which they have, into which capitalism at this point in time has carried them. So what I shall be talking about here is a sort of broad overview of where I see this theme of experimentation emerging, and where I think that it can be usefully developed. And looking at the whole array of papers that we're going to be listening to, I feel that probably, at the end of this, we will hopefully we will understand a lot better some of what we're talking about here. So I want to make rather than using the terminology of institutions, I'm going to use a bit this idea of communities of fate, and start with the idea that in the sort of post-war period up to the 1970s, 1980s, essentially people, firms, actors were locked into communities of fate that were defined by a particular national context. So to talk about varieties of capitalism, national business systems, when we used those terms, it was to describe the way in which societies constituted their populations with shared fates in the post-war settlement. And this was that there were broadly three shared fates at this point in time. The first was the Western world under US hegemony. The second was the Soviet world. And the third was what was labeled the Third World dependent on, in most cases, on commodities and subsistence agriculture. And so the communities of fate then were defined very much by the national context. And basically what my argument is that those national communities of fate that were held together by particular alliances of actors, particular role of the state, that those national communities of fate have increasingly dissolved. The institutions behind them have not entirely dissolved. There's still institutional dependency, there's still institutional legacies that we have to take into account. But for the fate of individuals, of firms, of regions, their fate is no longer dictated by their position within national communities, within particular national communities. And in fact, their fate, therefore, is dictated more by the new strategies that they can evolve in this changing world to achieve the goals that they've been developing. So it's this notion of a sort of fragmentation of fate that is the sort of driver, as I see it, of experimentation. And so just briefly, then, to rehearse some of these arguments, breaking up national communities of fate. So what were, in the past, fairly clear sort of groupings, these three worlds. These three worlds are no longer separated in the way they were. Rapid growth rates in emerging economies, declining growth rates in developed economies, and most particularly, and where I think many of us have most interest, is the flows of FDI and multinational production into these emerging economies, out of the developed economies, but also connecting the developed economies in new ways to the emerging economies through the creation of global value chains and innovation networks. And underpinning this, a set of enabling technologies that are open access, that are not confined to particular national contexts. So the fate of somebody working in supply chain in China connected to the fate of people, of retailers and buyers in the US. I mean, we know these are unequal connections. That's not the point. The point is that in the past, where these were very separate worlds, they are now more interconnected. And the national communities of fate are starting to break up from that point of view. And I just put a chart here to illustrate over the period from the 1950s, where you see through to the early 1970s, fairly sort of limited span in terms of the relative growth of GDP, leading up into 2010 to the massive expansion in East Asia, Southeast Asia, the top two of the curves. And so this sort of extension of different rates of growth and the interconnectedness that this reveals is an important part of this new story, where people are no longer so connected just to their particular society. And within societies, these national communities of fate are breaking up. So the extent of inequalities we've seen from the work of Thomas Piketty and others, particularly the speed with which the top 1% is moving away from the rest, the slowing social mobility, reproduction at the top and at the bottom, but stagnation in the middle. So what I'm getting at here again is that the degree to which people felt that they were in one community where political choice was essential, was important. Now, people are increasingly feeling that they're no longer part of one national community of fate. Depends upon which region they might be in within a particular society. Welfare systems increasingly differentiate in treatment. Employment conditions are increasingly diverse. So these national communities of fate then are withering away, and the result is that, in my view, that firms in particular, but also the actors that surround firms, are now having to think, well, what is there for us now that we no longer have this protection, we're no longer embedded in this particular structure? What is the game out there for us, the game that is not just within the national boundaries, but is more of positioning in a global context? This is just a graph which looks at various, the Gini index, the degree of income disparity, and showing the rise in various countries, including the US and China, but also the fall in certain countries. The fall in, for example, on this graph in Norway. So again, this idea that of increasing differentiation in the global economy and within national societies. So how do firms and actors respond to that sort of opening up of experimentation? Well, I think, and this is something that I want to emphasize, I think the great experiment that we're facing at the moment is the disembedding of markets. The great experiment is neoliberalism. The great experiment is getting rid of social regulations, social boundaries, and letting the market rule. I think that, you know, in a sense, this conference is built around the opposite assumption in a way, that actors can rebuild new communities at different levels and create different sorts of work and market governance. Well, yeah, I fully subscribe to the importance of that, but I think that we have to see that in the context of, as I say, what we could really label the great experiment of neoliberalism, which is ripping apart and taking out all these forms of social regulation. So in the rest of the talk, really, I am want to hold both of these two things, this great experiment of neoliberalism and markets and disembedding of markets on the one hand, and on the other hand, the effort to develop new forms of communities for experimental governance. And I suggest here that we can think, and I'm sure that we will be talking about this in many of the sessions, that there are sort of two basic frames around which these forms of communities can be built. And one is political identities. But here, I think that the old states, certainly the old states of Europe, are increasingly unable to provide that. They are already so deeply penetrated, certainly the UK and the US, by the centrality of the neoliberal notion of what experimentation means, that I see it's very difficult for these old states to lead experimentation towards new forms of market embeddedness. But on the other hand, we're seeing the rise of potential new states which do have do have this on their agenda, and the obvious one for somebody from the UK to perceive is Scotland, which you know, is very much looking at ways to establish new forms of market embeddedness, and that relates to the development of regional identities and mega cities. So we have, you know, sort of the contradiction that we have in New York, a left-leaning mayor, Bill Blasio. We have a left-leaning mayor in Paris. Maybe in London, after Boris Johnson leaves, we'll have a left-leaning mayor there who will also need to sort of manage this relationship between inequalities in the city and the dominance of finance. So that's one side. And then on the other side is the question of economic identities. To what degree can we see the generation of firm-level solidarities, trade union solidarities, etc.? So my basic argument here then is we've reached a stage of experimentation. The biggest push is towards experimenting with markets. The alternative form of experimentation, building identities, controlling markets, etc., there are a variety of possible places where that can happen. But I want to say, go slightly further and to suggest that there are two ways we might consider the difficulties that actors have in this process. And one is blockages. So actors want to change institutions, want to move, want to experiment. The first thing is, can they do that, or are they blocked from doing that? And here, I use the term blockage to emphasize particularly conflict between actors over change, zero-sum games. So, on the one hand, disembedding the market, the neoliberal solution, versus reconstructing communities and institutions. And then I also suggest that something different to that also can happen, and that is where social actors become trapped in suboptimal patterns. So I use this term trap. And I sort of think that maybe these are two different processes, one of which is more zero-sum than the other. And so I think it might be, I think that traps do offer, getting out of traps offer more possibilities for coalitions than, and movement than do straightforward fights over blockages. So from the point of view of the neoliberal great experiment, the blockages are to the market, and quite simply, deregulation of all these different areas, pushing there, and obviously this process goes to a different extent in different countries, but also the idea of emergent experimental forms that arise out of this, the financialized firm, something that we need to be looking at in a lot more detail. I know there is a lot of work on it at the moment. Also, I've called it the network firm at the moment, but I sort of see it more as an emptied out version of the firm, which is just basically managing a series of subcontracts of various sorts. These I think, are the emergent experimental forms that arise from the neoliberal agenda, and this leads to increase in inequality, insecure work, etc. But on the other hand, there are blockages where the block is to how can we rebuild communities? How can we rebuild around localities, around supply chains, etc., new forms of work or an organisation? I think hopefully this is where we're going to hear lots of examples and learn lots in this conference. Emergent experimental forms and outcomes through upgrading, through higher skilled employment, local embeddedness. Now, just as I said, the term blockage I see as very much leading to this sort of zero-sum battle between different actors. Whereas the term traps are used to define actors caught in a suboptimal set of relationships where there's a high level of inertia. And how do you spring a trap? Well, I hope we can sort of learn more about it. But for example, if we look at the low-skill equilibrium trap that many people have talked about, what societies have sprung that trap and how? Well, you could say that Korea post-1997 sprung that trap, whereas Brazil, even during its boom period, has been unable to spring that trap. Resource dependency, another trap into which Brazil has fallen, in other words, dependence on commodities and an inability to diversify. Other societies, Norway, Australia, Canada, have managed to add value and investment. And in technology traps, a country like Finland, which for a time became very dependent on Nokia, has nevertheless survived the reshaping and the restructuring of Nokia. Whereas if you look at telecoms, and looking at a sectoral level here in Japan, Japan got trapped inside its own technology, and the Japanese refer to the Galapagos effect here, thanks, which meant that their phones were highly developed for Japan, but nobody else wanted them, or they couldn't survive anywhere else. So I think what's interesting, potentially interesting about traps is that that this engages managers, employees, local states, etc., in working out how to get out of this trap, how to move up the value chain, how to diversify the economy, how to improve skills in the economy. And it's less the zero-sum type of activity. So I'm interested in looking at where we can maybe identify traps and getting out of traps as opposed to blockages and the conflicts over blockages. So the third final point here is well, what triggers for change do we identify? And here, external economic crisis, internal capacities for response, and we can look at what's going on inside the Eurozone to see the different capacities here. And this relates to the legacy of the state and state institutions. But there's another set, which is the regional level, which I think is reflected very much in the papers that are presented here, that there's opportunities at the regional levels for overcoming blockages and traps. And here, the role that multinationals and the management of their supply chains, the management of their learning processes, I think are also aspects that could be relevant here. And finally, moving a bit away from my area of knowledge, but the demography of what's going to happen in the future in terms of young and old in the labour force, and in terms of increasing women's participation in the labour force. Under what terms does that occur, and how much are those sort of things going to be triggers for change? So just to finish then, the old forces for cohesion and constructing a shared fate are dissolving. This offers the opportunity, or effectively means that that firms and regions, etc., need to look for new experimental forms. One of these is the neoliberal form, maximising market relations. The other is rebuilding communities of fate in new ways. But there are blockages and traps to both of these processes. And I think what will be interesting over the next few days is to find out and look at examples where these blockages and traps are being overcome and where new communities of fate are being constructed that are no longer so embedded in national communities of fate. Thank you.